So first up, we have Jordan asking, can you train plyos every session, or is that a bad idea for weightlifting strength? So that is a bad idea. You can do it, but I wouldn't really recommend doing it, to give you a Project Chavez answer. So the issue with plyometric training, if you're doing it every session, is that it's unlikely that you're going to be recovered enough that you can do really high quality plyometric training systems. So plyometric training, high velocity, high skill. What do we do? What do we know we need when we're doing high velocity, high skill movements is that they need to be at the start of a training session. We know we need to be fresh from them. We also know that they can be quite fatiguing in their own particular way. So if we're doing weightlifting or strength training, it's pretty fatiguing as it is, certainly fatiguing enough to impact a high velocity, high skill movement like plyometric work. So we know that we already have quite an amount of fatigue. This fatigue is going in the direction of the sport we want to do, aka strength or weightlifting. So we're going to mildly negatively impact your weightlifting or your strength training, but that can be mitigated by load management. But more importantly, if you're trying to be progressive with your plyometric work and you're trying to get better at it, 2 times a week is usually the sweet spot for most people. The issue is that you're going to be fatigued from your weightlifting and your strength training. You're also going to be fatigued from your plyometric work. So what's going to inevitably happen is you're going to start getting slower. You're going to start getting a little bit less sharp with the accuracy of your movements. So if you're doing plyometric movements, you could be doing bounds, repeated hop, intensive, extensive. All of these are going to start to suffer if we do too much plyometric training. So you could use plyometric training, and we do see some weightlifters using this as a priming exercise, as a warm-up for their weightlifting. I don't particularly love this method. I think it's better just to get into the weightlifting session. General warm-up for sure, mobility at the right times, but when it comes to plyometric as a warm-up, it can be nice. But if you're using plyometric as a warm-up, then you're not really going to be able to do enough volume in plyometric work or enough intensive work to actually get better at plyometric stuff. So if you like plyometric stuff for warming up for weightlifting, then that's totally fine. You can absolutely add that in. It's no issue. It's not going to cause any major change to your weightlifting. If anything, it might be nice because you might get into the rhythm and the habit of using plyometric training to warm up for your strength or your weightlifting. And if you keep this short, less than 10 minutes, then you're going to be in a good position because you'll have found a warm-up that you like doing, and a nice consistent warm-up can be very, very useful because your body begins to remember those habits. It begins to remember those pre-performance routines that you're doing. And if you start every session with a certain number of jumps, psychologically you're in this position where you're like, it's go time, it's training. If you had a long day at work, I don't know what you do, but if you work a lot and then you have this very particular routine, it's a really good way of reframing from work or family life to training life. So in a roundabout way, that could be useful. But if it's purely for, I want to get better plyometrics and I want to get better plyometrics for weightlifting or strength training, it's not the best way. So every session is definitely not a good idea. 2 times a week really is the sweet spot for a lot of people. So next we've got, can squat cause lordosis? How heavy does 300 kilos feel? Can squats cause lordosis? I don't know. I haven't seen that happen. But again, we're not physical therapists or physios or neuromuscular therapists, so I can't give you an answer based on that. I can give you an answer on how heavy does 300 kilos feel, and honestly, not that heavy. If you can squat 300 kilos, it won't feel that heavy. 300 kilos feels, to be honest, as heavy as 200 kilos did the first time. When I couldn't squat 300 kilos, when I failed it the first 2 times, the first time I tried 300 kilos, it didn't feel heavy, but the barbell feels very, very different once you get into certain orders of weightlifting or certain orders of squatting, for example, and it feels similar with the squat and the bench as well. But when you are squatting, everything from about 120 kilos to 200 is like, yeah, it's pretty similar, to be honest with you. 200 to 230, the barbell feels quite similar, but then there is this change from 240 to 270. It's not necessarily that the barbell feels heavier, although of course it does feel heavier because it is heavier. But there's this change in the whip, the oscillation, the general organization of the lift. It's just a little bit different when you go from that kind of 200-ish into the 240s or so. There is a noticeable change, especially the first time. Once you get used to it, it's not really a major difference. It's not a strength thing. It's quite literally the skill of managing those barbells, especially if you're using bumper plates and weightlifting barbells. They're quite whippy, which is why we often see powerlifters choose not to use them. So to answer your question shortly, 300 kilos didn't feel that heavy. It felt heavy when I missed it, but it didn't even feel that heavy. And the interesting thing about that whole training block last year, so I went from basically 0 to 300. So I went from not squatting and I doing jiu-jitsu to 300. And I didn't miss a single squat for that whole 11-month training block. And the first squat that I thought I was going to miss was 300 kilos. So as I was squatting it up above parallel, I was like, oh fuck, I might miss this as I was squatting it up. Now this all happened very, very quickly at the speed of thought, of course, but as I was getting above parallel, I was like, this could quite literally be the first squat that I missed in an 11-month training block. And I would be like, how unfucking fortunate would that be if I missed 300 kilos after not missing a single squat for the whole block? Luckily, as you know, I didn't miss 300 kilos. I successfully squatted it, but I was like, there's a little bit of respect for 300 kilos. But it was really, I remember as I was getting above parallel, I was like, oh, this is heavy. I was like, this isn't a miss from muscular, like this isn't a miss from technical failure or I'm not super fresh. This would be a miss because this might be too heavy for me right now. Now it wasn't, of course. And looking back on it, it looked very good. But at the time I was like, oh, interesting. But in terms of 300 kilos in your back, if you can squat 300 kilos, if you're in a position to go squat 300 kilos, it won't feel that heavy. If you've never squatted 300 kilos, if you've never squatted 150 kilos, 300 kilos will feel heavy, of course. No question, just want to say loving the content. I do appreciate that. Thank you very much. We're at 57,000 subs on YouTube now. You might have noticed a slight change in our content. So we're just really leaning into as much training informational content as possible, and from a purely business point of view, I would say, is to demonstrate our knowledge and show people that this is how we think is the best way to train in these particular scenarios, whether that's weightlifting or powerlifting or athletes, as you've seen. And then if we get slightly less views, then that's fine, or significantly less views, that's fine, as long as it's bringing in the right people to us who need that information and want to train better. That for us is the most important part of YouTube at the moment. Now that's not to say we're not going to do engaging, interesting videos in terms of content, but priority number one for any video we do, except for shit talks, is this training information highly valuable training information? So for example, track cyclist last week, Robert Forstman, that's pretty niche. You know, he's a famous figure, he's a popular figure, I would say, but in terms of, you know, popular sports, track cycling isn't exactly, any domain in track cycling isn't exactly the most popular sport. Robert Forstman is popular because of his ginormous legs, but he's not super popular for being a track cyclist, as it were. And now I know there's people watching us who love track cycling, but this is coming from a weightlifter. We have to understand that our sports aren't, you know, they're not the NBA, they're not the NFL, they're not Formula One, so they're primarily for people who do track cycling and want to know, how do I approach the S&C for track cycling? Is hip internal rotation different from knee valgus? A lot of lifters have internal rotation at the bottom of the squat. So knee valgus is often called dynamic knee valgus. Now there's a little bit of restructuring, or people want to restructure our thoughts around knee valgus in terms of the squat. So you need internal rotation to hit a deep squat position, certainly in anything coming close to ass to grass. You need that internal rotation, but you can have that internal rotation without those knees coming inside the line of your toes. Now, what the literature will call dynamic knee valgus is any medial movement of your knees towards the center line of your body. So if you imagine there is a line straight down from your nose, perfectly straight, that in an athletic endeavor, if your knees are moving towards this is what most clinicians and researchers would call dynamic knee valgus, because it's happening during movement and you're pushing those knees inward. What's currently going on is we're seeing a lot of people arguing and a bit of research, and I will say I don't think the research is super weighty either way just yet. Some of the research that coming out, in my opinion, isn't amazing. Some of it's very, very interesting. And unfortunately, I would take the position right now that the information we have from research side of things doesn't really tell us a whole lot if dynamic knee valgus or knee valgus in the squat, as we know it, where the knees move in, is going to cause a major issue. There's some interesting research. Some of it is, depending on what way you would look at it, would be information that you might say that's not a great way of measuring certain things. And there's some people who are saying knee valgus in the squat is better, but they're not saying they won't coach it. They're not saying they'll coach that, but they're saying it's a better way of recruiting your hip extensors. They're saying it's your adductor magnus getting involved better. I don't agree with those positions, but that's not to say that I think those people are stupid or anything like that. I remember we're really about not calling out people or talking shit on any coaches. So that's why I'm not talking about any in particular. I have seen in a few places, one of the things I have seen, which is quite interesting, is people will very often use weightlifters because we don't see a lot of dynamic knee valgus in squatting and powerlifters because it's detrimental in terms of position. Because what usually happens is knee valgus, when we push our knees in, very often male lifters ends up in a rearward shifting of our hips, so those hips move farther away from our heels. This generally causes a hinging position, and as a result is a worse position because we converge those knees. We don't see those knees going forward once we get above parallel. What we see is those hips going further back, shifting the barbell forward, and we get this good morning effect, which is not good in squatting. Now, what we might see with some weightlifters, particularly female weightlifters, is we'll see this knee valgus movement, but they'll also have a huge amount of range of motion in a lot of areas in their body. They'll have very good mobility. They'll have great dorsiflexion. So what we'll see with these female lifters is they'll have great thoracic extension, great dorsiflexion. Their knees will converge somewhat. It'll move inside the line of their body. Sometimes we'll see a lot of inward knee movement. And what we'll also see is a corresponding forward movement of those knees. So they're compensating by pulling the hips forward, staying in this really extended position so that barbell stays over their center of support. And as a result, we get a successful lift. Now, the issue here is that in male lifters and a lot of female lifters, that's not always a great way. We often see a lack of leg drive then as we get above that parallel position with those lifters. If we see excessive internal movement of those knees, so if we see the knees converge too much, very often we'll see a lack of ability to continue to extend the hips. But more importantly, what we're often seeing as well, I'll see people using elite weightlifters and saying, elite weightlifters do it and they're fine. And let me tell you, elite weightlifters are not fine. Most elite weightlifters have lots of knee pain, and they have it very frequently throughout their career. Now, someone will say, that's load management. That's not a technical issue. And I would say both of those are pretty intrinsically linked. But on top of that, you don't know for sure, as of yet, in my opinion, based on the research available, that knee valgus isn't contributing to it. Do I think it's a major issue if you experience knee valgus at certain times? I think that's not really a major issue. How much knee valgus is available to you. How much you want to deal with. Again, it's up to you to see how much knee valgus you want to put up with. But when it comes to these elite lifters and confidently saying that knee valgus is fine, I can tell you if we're going down that road of using lifters as an example to prove your point, unfortunately, in these cases, it's not correct. People will very frequently use a lot of elite lifters that I'll either know have knee pain or I know them personally. For example, I'll see Miso use in some of those videos. And I know for a fact Miso dealt with a lot of knee pain coming up until Tokyo and after Tokyo on both knees, bilateral knee pain. Lots of lifters will experience bilateral knee pain. So I wouldn't be really aggressively saying internal rotation or knee valgus is fine. Bring those knees in, extend your hips harder. I think it's a worse technical position, and that's where we are primarily concerned is this a more efficient way of moving a lot of weight? And we do not see that being the case. And what you'll also see if you're really astute, if you watch those elite lifters, you will see that a lot of elite lifters only have that knee valgus to a very noticeable degree at those very heavy weights. And the better squatters in weightlifting, because we don't really see this in powerlifting, the better squatters in weightlifting have less knee valgus. So if we look at someone like Tian Tao, we might see the small inward movement of the knees, but if we watch Tian Tao warming all the way up, we'll see very little amount of this knee valgus. If we look at any other squatters, the big one at the moment is Carlos Nazar does a lot of internal rotation of the knees. Now, I don't know if he's working on that, but I just wouldn't be jumping the gun super early. Now, if you're listening to this and you feel very strongly about it, or if there's a clip on Instagram, then just relax a little bit. If we're using what I view from my point of view as the current information available, I don't know if knee valgus is a major contributor to knee pain, but what I do think right now is that I don't think the evidence can tell us really strongly either way, because I don't think we can use too much anecdotal evidence in elite weightlifters because lots of them have knee pain, have had at some point, do right now or will again in the future. So I don't think that's a great scenario. What we look at it, or the way we think about it here, is that knee valgus is not an optimal technical movement. So even if it was an amazing way to extend your hips in an unloaded position, once we start loading it up, we just don't see that happening. Because one of the interesting things, knee valgus is often associated with lack of dorsiflexion. There is some good research in that, but we can see that practically from people's training. So if you want to get this compensation where your knees are moving forward, if we're lacking this dorsiflexion and we've got this knee valgus, what we're going to see is this hip shifting back. And I will say finally on top of that, I don't know any strong squatters or coaches of strong people who are like, yeah, we coach knee valgus in the squat. And if I see it happening, I think it's totally okay. A lot of them are like, okay, probably not ideal, do need to take note of it. So if we're seeing lifters and we see that a lot of knee valgus, it's definitely something we'll take note of. And if it becomes a problem, we probably would address it. That was a bit of a long one there, but I've been thinking about this a lot recently in case you haven't thought about it. Any negative side effects of using a belt? So there's two negative side effects that I would generally consider things that happen quite commonly for lifters if they're experiencing negative side effects from a belt. The first is they just use a belt too early. So if you're brand new to strength training, I like to keep the belt away for about the first year. And I like this because belts generally inhibit your bracing skill. So it's not that they're inhibiting your muscular development or lacking your strength development. It's just that if you're very new to strength training, your ability to brace is probably pretty poor. Those coordination, how you organize yourself with heavy weights, and as heavy weights get heavier and as you're moving with these heavy weights, if you don't have this kind of minimum standard of bracing, you're holding yourself back. So I'd like to see just within that first year, you don't use the belt. And once you're pretty proficient, and usually about the year mark is a decent place to look at this, you can say, okay, I can add in a belt, 80% of the way into the training block, 50% of the way into the training block. I add in a belt 60% above one of my 1 rep max. Whatever value you want to put in it and whatever you want to be consistent with, that's totally fine. But the main issue for us is that don't add in a belt too early. If you don't have any experience of strength training, because this skill of brace yourself and organize yourself with those weights is something that is actually quite simple to learn, and it's something that once you're progressing a good technique, the belt isn't going to hold you back with as you get heavier. But if you add it in too early, we do see that you can lack that skill a little bit, and so you do benefit from a little bit of training without the belt. So it's not that you can't rectify it again in the future if you've worn a belt too early. It's just that if you're new to strength training, you haven't used a belt yet, and you're still within that first year of serious strength training, just give it another few months and then you can add it in and experiment with it. The other big negative side effect we often see is if people experience back pain and they can cover it up with a belt, it's usually a recipe for disaster further down the line. You'll often see people say, yeah, my back doesn't hurt that much when I'm deadlifting, but when I throw on the belt, it feels a lot better. And that's usually a recipe for much worse back pain later. So if the belt is covering up your back pain, there's another issue going on there. What that might be could be any number of things, but they're the two main ones, is that lack of skill of bracing. If you add in the belt too early, can be an issue. And then the other one is that if you're covering up back pain with a belt, then you have other issues and you need to address it and forget about the lifting, whatever that lift is right now, because that's a bigger issue. So Mickey's asking, exclusively high bar for powerlifting. It's a bit weaker, but can't find the groove at low bar at all after even a few years. So this is an interesting question. The issue here is that, to cut to the chase, I have yet to see a lifter who couldn't squat more low bar compared to the high bar. Now, we might immediately think, oh, John Hack. But I think even in John Hack's case, we'd probably see him squat a bit more low bar. If we are to follow the principle of why low bar works better, it's because we have the shorter lever, it's closer to our center of balance, and so we're not punishing our upper back as much as possible, or our back as a whole. It's under less pressure, being pushed forward, so we can maintain that back position better. And generally the barbell travel distance is less with that low bar, obviously as well, because we're traveling to just below parallel, depending on your federation's rules. So I would say think long and hard about this. There's no reason you can't switch back to the low bar, but if you're having problems now, if you take a big break from low bar and essentially just go exclusively high bar squatting, you are going to find that you're probably going to return to low bar at some stage. So I would say the issue here is probably the technical issue. Now, I didn't look at any of your lifts, but realistically, the low bar is probably the way to go, or at least mid-bar position. I'd play around with it, but I don't think the high bar would be the way to go. If I answer this without knowing about your lifting situation, we've yet to see a lifter who's better at high bar compared to their low bar when they're competing in powerlifting. Low bar never feels good. It's always uncomfortable. It always hurts. It gets heavier again than on the high bar, so you're really pushing your physiological limits to the capacity. And if you really are honest about it, the low bar hurts. It causes a lot of pain as the training blocks go on. And even if it's not hurting you right now, feeling good is something that it's quite hard for that low bar to get to a position where you feel super confident in the low bar. I suppose if you use John Hack again as an example, he just prefers high bar squatting. Now, it's not really holding him back in terms of beating everyone, but where you compare him to himself, would you put money, or would I put money on the fact that would John Hack squat a bit more if he squatted low bar? And I would say the answer, if you take it in terms of biomechanics and statistics, he would squat more low bar. Now, if you just can't make it work and you can't figure out why by yourself, then if the high bar just feels better and something you want to do, no one's stopping you from doing that. But I would say if you really want to push those numbers for powerlifting, the low bar is the answer. So I would be very slow to say go ahead if your all-time goal is the biggest squat you can manage within the powerlifting rules. Then I would say definitely low bar is the answer for competition. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use the high bar in your training, but when it comes to peaking for powerlifting competitions and the squat style you do in competition, low bar is the way to go. I'm always open to someone being the true exception to the rule for some combination of reasons, but I would say, without saying your particular case, I would say the low bar probably is a better answer. Tips for programming for yourself, what to think about when prepping for a comp. So I don't know what sport this is in relation to, but there is essentially kind of 3 different brackets you can learn about programming for yourself. One is experience and just going out and doing it. The other is education, so reading, listening, learning, writing, all that good stuff, watching Sika Strength, reading studies, reading textbooks. And then the other one is getting coached or getting mentored. And I would say experience in isolation is probably the weakest of these 3, because you can really spin your wheels for a long time. And most people do spin their wheels a lot for a very long time if you are just exclusively coaching yourself. Now, coaching in combination with education is definitely quite useful. So this can progress us a little bit further, because if you are a logical person, if you're someone who can really project manage yourself, if you can be as objective as you possibly can be about yourself, and you're educating yourself from books and studies and textbooks and YouTube and all that good stuff, you're going to progress a little bit further. But I would say getting coached by someone else is probably one of the best ways to progress your actual training. But also on top of that, getting coached by someone else allows you to experience someone who's probably further along the education knowledge in terms of coaching than you. So, if you are 2 years into lifting, you've never been coached by anyone, and you've minimal education and coaching, if you compare how much you know about training compared to someone who's been coaching for 15 years, has experienced a lot of training themselves, has read a lot of information, has gotten coached or mentored or talked to or experienced with or learned from other great coaches and athletes, they're going to be so much further ahead of you than you would be by yourself. So if the case is programming for yourself, I would say look at these 3 templates, see what you are lacking in at the moment or what you could probably leverage within reason. So could you experience more training yourself? Possibly. Could you learn more? Very likely. Could you get mentored or learned from people or get coached by other good people? I would say very likely as well. So they're the 3 brackets I would look at, and I would just say figure it out on your own without trying to follow someone's system or someone's education, or at least follow your own system. I would say you're going to be in for a very hard time. It may work out in the end, but it will definitely, I'm super confident in this, it will definitely slow down your progress in the short term. And probably in the long term, it's hard to say. It depends how much you make up your knowledge. Opinions, key points on S&C work in younger adolescents, particularly in a soccer context. So how we almost always approach strength and conditioning work for adolescents, so teen lifters or teen athletes, whether that be in weightlifting all the way to soccer here or jiu-jitsu or rugby, is we're thinking about them at the really bottom end of the pyramid, or that triangle in terms of periodization. So if we look at a normal training block or a bigger chunk of a year for an adult or developed lifter, if we take soccer players, we're going to have in-season, off-season, we're going to look at GPP or strength work, and then maximal strength work. Then we're going to be looking at power stuff and conditioning, and then into that season. So that might take the place over the course of 6 to 12 months, depending on what position we get them and when we get them, and where they are and how they're well trained and how much they've done at that stage, if they say they're in their 20s or 30s or whatever. But when it comes to the teenage athletes, we're really at the bottom of that. So I want you to imagine their whole teenage block as the bottom end of that scale. So we'll largely treat most of those years from the ages of 12 to probably somewhere around 18 years old, maybe even a little bit later, depending on how proficient they are, as a very basic training. So the real base of that triangle. So you're almost taking year on year. You're never really moving too far out of that GPP phase or the higher rep stuff, the general physical training, until you get them into their kind of adulthood. Now you're going to do some maximal strength, of course, but most of the year, most of the time is going to be spent, certainly when they have time for gym training, is going to be spent doing this bottom of the triangle training. And I want you to think about their whole adolescent years as the bottom of this triangle, and you barely come up out of it too frequently. You're just developing a lot of skills, you're developing a lot of familiarity with their body, you're developing their muscle mass, and we're very rarely going to be going super heavy for those singles. We're very rarely going to be testing their maxes. We're going to be spending most of the time doing higher rep training, and we see this work really well. It just develops units. You want to take as much advantage of that muscle mass development as you can from these younger lifters, especially when it comes to field sports. You just want to be developing their work capacity, muscle mass, general coordination, really basic skills, really basic components that they would need to develop. And you just, essentially for most of their adolescence years, you keep them in the bottom of that triangle if you think about periodization. So top is the sport specific end of things, and then the bottom here is their general physical capacity for training. We just spend most of their time at the bottom here, most of their time doing higher rep work, still doing squat, bench, deadlift, whatever it is in their particular needs, still doing unilateral work, but we're not really going to be pushing for absolute 1RM numbers. They will definitely go up as time goes on. That's the beauty of teenagers. If you get someone at 14 and train them till they're 13 in this manner, so if we're training them for soccer at this stage, and we're just looking at higher volume work in the squat, higher volume work in the unilateral work, higher volume upper body stuff, we're just never really going to be pushing for those singles because, one, they don't really need to. It's not that it's going to stunt their growth or anything like that, but you'll see teenagers' coordination when it comes to those heavier lifts is quite poor. And I know the immediate thought process there as well, if they don't practice it, they're never going to learn that skill. But practicing strength training for them, most of the time, staying away from those heavy singles, we're not really super concerned with that 1RM because you just don't need to be. If you're pushing their 5x5 or their 5x8 or their 4 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 12, whatever that is, and you kind of keep running through those, you'll see that a 1RM goes up very, very easily. And it's just a waste of a session most of the time with these lifters because the absolute 1RM they're pushing, unless they're a freak athlete, unless they're on a boatload of SARMs, they're not going to be hitting very big numbers. And most of the time it's just kind of, it might be fun for them, which is fine in certain scenarios. So if you do those 1RM tests in a safe situation, that's totally fine. But when it comes to actively, what does most of their training look like? Most of their training for most of that year is that general training, that kind of non-specific strength work where you're just doing lots of squatting for volume. You're progressing through the weights, of course. You're moving from your 12s down to your 5s and then to your 3s, but you very often just won't bother going for those heavy singles because you'll usually surpass those singles for 5s or 8s in 6 months' time. So if they're squatting 100 kilos now when they're 14, you'll find by 15 or 16 that if you're training them correctly, they'll be squatting their 150 kilos for 5s or 6s or whatever without ever really having gone for that 1RM. We just find this not really necessary, and that skill of 1RM stuff can be developed later, but right now it's not a concern. It's a waste of a session. Teenagers are kind of dumb, and it's likely they're going to hurt themselves from whatever we see. I know We keep seeing weightlifting is totally safe and no one ever gets hurt lifting, but as far as I'm concerned, and when I see it ourselves and with athletes, is that most or a lot of injuries come from heavy singles. And sometimes that's totally fine. As an adult, that makes perfect sense. But a teenager is more likely to hurt themselves from heavy single because they'll have less practice with those heavy singles and they're going to be a little bit dumber, which is one of the reasons they can train pretty hard. But you don't need to train them hard in those heavy singles. This is no point. There's no concern for that. You're better off just doing that volume. More useful for a session for them is getting an extra 2 weeks of sets of 5 or sets of 3s. That's much more productive training. And then when they're older, then you can look for those heavy singles in the appropriate time in the off season. But for adolescents, we're just never really concerned with that heavy single. We're looking to build that base as much as possible and keep them safe and not hurt them from their strength training, because we love strength training and we train like dumbasses and train athletes hard. Of course, our programs are hard, but there's no point training stupid and there's no point jeopardizing lifters. We've all seen those videos, and if you've coached teenage athletes, aside from those videos, if you're someone who's coached younger teams, especially teams of teenage athletes, and I'm really talking about teenage boys here, if you've coached teams of teenage boys and you let them loose in the gym for everyone to go do a heavy single, I know there's coaches watching this who've been in the situation where you are like, holy shit, why did I do this? So very often it's a much more productive scenario that let them just move through that volume and stick with that for most of their training block. And then when they're older, this pays off incredibly well, and we've seen it quite a bit. And I'd like to keep testing it on adolescents, athletes, to kind of continue to prove that point. But if you look at any of the ex-Soviet nations, if you look at any of the ex-USSR countries, that's actually how a lot of them will train their athletics or their track and field or any of the other sports when it comes to what they're pushing for higher rep stuff. They'll train their adolescents like this. And the weightlifters push a bit more for 1RMs, of course, but they'll also be giving them boatloads of PEDs, which is fine. Well, that's actually not fine. That's one thing we hate about PEDs, but that's a time for another story. But it's fine in terms of context of training, because then they are manifesting adult strength in those teenagers, among other many negative side effects for them. But in terms of the training they do, a lot of them are used to do is more general physical training. And so that's how we approach training for teenagers. So I think you know about a lot of them. So jiu-jitsu is kind of a hobby, I suppose, as opposed to the eternal burning fire of weightlifting for me. Deer hunting, if you listen to Shit Talk, do a lot of hunting. You probably don't know that I like reading and also like some video games. I also really like cars. Cars, unfortunately, is a very expensive and time-consuming hobby, so I have minimal time for cars at the moment. I do like a nice car, expensive car, but a particularly well-functioning, nice car that operates well. I grew up around cars a lot. All of my older siblings and my uncles were heavily into motorsport, rallying, hot rod, and it's something I just grew up around a lot, and it's something that rubbed off on me. Not as much as them, but it is something I do really like, is cars and motorsports. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to it at the moment, so it's something that I have an interest in, and I am somewhat particular about what cars I'll drive. And at times I'll drive shit boxes, and sometimes I'll buy a nice car, depending on what situation you're in. At the moment I have quite a nice car, which I'm quite happy with. But cars is something I do like, but not so much that I would spend a huge chunk of money that I didn't have, or spend a whole lot of time that I don't have on cars. I love reading. Reading is something that I will do regularly, and I just really like fiction, to be honest. I don't particularly read a lot of non-fiction. And I read a lot of fantasy. Currently I'm reading Mark Lawrence's The Book That Broke the World, and it was the library that couldn't be burned. So I love Mark Lawrence. I like Anthony Ryan, Ian McKellen. Is Ian McKellen? Some good authors. A lot of fantasy in the last couple of years has been absolutely abysmal. Certainly in the last 4 to 5 years has been very disappointing for a lot of fantasy. Now, there's also a load of fantasy out there. The problem is there's so much fantasy out there. If you go to read something and it's shit, and you go to the next one and it's shit, it really leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Or I've frequently gotten a third or halfway through books, and I've just been like, what the fuck is going on here? Even from authors I like. So I have to say, over the last few years, Mark Lawrence has really been someone who has been really consistent. I will say, I'm not going to lie, if you read Mark Lawrence, this new series, the book, The Library That Couldn't Be Burned or whatever, the interspecies romantic relationships is a little bit weird. I won't ruin it for you if you haven't read it yet, but it has taken me out of the story a few times where I've been like, this is a bit strange. If you read Mark Lawrence, do let me know your thoughts on this, but I'm getting kind of furry vibes from it. I'm getting like, oh, this is kind of this is a bit too like fan fiction smut kind of. Like, if it's like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, I think Mark Lawrence is a great world builder. He's a great writer. His dialogue is very good. Never very cheesy, or just cheesy enough where you're reading fancy and you're like, you know, this is okay. Like the Broken Empire trilogy, or the Empire of Thorns trilogy, is really good. And I like his quirkiness. I like that kind of wacky shit sometimes. But the interspecies romantic relationships that are brewing in the second book. The first book, I was like, oh, okay, that's a novel surprise when it happened. But then in the second book, I'm like, I have been reading it and I've been like, this is kind of weird, and it's making me not thoroughly enjoy the story. So maybe it's just a personal taste thing. I've no problem with romantic relationships in books or whatever I'm reading, but this is a little bit weird. So if you're reading Mark Lawrence, let me know. And the other one then is, I do like playing video games. Unfortunately, I obviously purposely allow very little time to play video games. Video games, while fun, I view as mindless entertainment or escapism, I suppose. And so as a result of that, I don't dedicate a lot of time to them. So some weeks you were talking 30 minutes a week of video games. And I think if you're spending too much time playing video games as an adult, I'm not one to tell you how to live your life, but you do need to take a look at how other things are going and just make sure that you're dedicating time to a lot of other areas, because you're working a full-time job and you're maintaining good relationships and you have other hobbies that allow you to maintain social relationships and you're getting enough sleep and you're training. You probably shouldn't have too much time playing video games. Now, I know the answer people will say there is, oh, how often do people work Netflix, or how often do you spend your phone? And I don't think those wrongs correct, or whatever you want to call those other ones make up for, well, I could be doing heroin kind of argument. I just think it's important to, and if I look at myself objectively as someone who definitely at some points probably engaged a bit too much, certainly when I was younger, maybe as a teenager, which didn't matter as much then, but I would say as an adult, do try and be conscious of it. Same with anything, you know, if you're playing 1 or 2 hours a week or 2 or 3 hours a week or something, I think that's fine. But if you're getting to the rounds where you're, you know, you see people and they've like done like 12 hours a week on gaming, I would be concerned, especially men. We see this a lot with, if you've done a lot of that, then I would say, this is my personal thoughts on it, that you might be spending a bit too much time playing games. But I do like playing video games when I get the chance. I recently got the new Warhammer game, Space Marine. I got it 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately I've only played about an hour total since. But I usually the time between before going to bed and after I've done everything, so I try to get there in the weekends. I usually have a rule where I don't play it midweek or on weeknights. So, but I do like some video games for sure if I get a chance. But unfortunately, the time I have is pretty limited. And actually, it's not unfortunately. That's the wrong word. I'm not losing anything by not playing video games. It's not time sensitive. So I enjoy the time I get to play video games. You know, if I get an hour and a half to play video games in a row, I'm pretty chuffed. But if I don't get it, I'm like, yeah, whatever. I go to bed on time. I do all my other stuff. I do my, like, there's familiar relationships, social relationships, you know, training, work, household chores, whatever else above video games, you know. And if I get through all of these and there's 45 minutes before I go to bed to play, then I'm chuffed for it. But if it's not there, I don't think twice about it. And I think that's probably, maybe for me at least, I think that's probably the best way to put it, or the best way to leave it. Farthest shot you've ever taken on a deer? I think my happiest shot was last year, or my best shot I've ever taken was about 220 meters for a headshot on a deer. So I was very, very happy with that. For a Sika deer, actually. Very nice shot. I was very happy. It was a follow-on shot it was the second animal in the same group, so I was very, very, very happy with that. It's probably one of my best shots, and that was definitely probably my furthest. I don't like taking long shots. I'm not really set up for it. My gun isn't set up for that, and I don't really have any interest in it. And I kind of have the opinion that if you're shooting out beyond 200 meters or so, maybe say 250, it's kind of like, what way are you approaching your hunting? Certainly in Ireland anyway, I have that opinion. But yeah, I think there was like 220 meters, which is definitely the limit of what I would be. Okay, let's leave it there. I think that's probably enough for the shit talk today. So a little bit of training, a little bit of non-training, and I hope you're having a great weekend. And Dara should be back for the next shit talk, and he'll be back for his holiday. But more importantly, he will be recovered from his sickness, because I think they've kind of gotten to the bottom a little bit of what may be causing it. And obviously it's rampant PED use, so that's obviously the answer. So, and the correction, the cure for it is more PED use. So Dara should be up and running. I know he's feeling a lot better already today, and a couple of days break from his no harm, because he works very hard. He does a lot. So a little break from there. So we'll see you next on the shit talk, and I'll see you for the next few videos. Obviously, plenty of videos in between those two. So I hope you're having a great weekend, and mwah.